Unmuted.
Everything is, we are unmuted. Down here now.
Give you also
And our videos.
So it's my pleasure to introduce Josephine Johnston today. She's partly in the Bioethics Centre, but also in the Hastings Centre. And the topic that you're talking about today is one that we should all be thinking about. So I think the implications of targeted therapy, and so what genetics is going to mean, both in terms of research and therapy, is hugely important. So I'm really glad you're talking about that today.
Thanks very much, John. I am really happy to talk about this. Actually, I spoke about it when I interviewed for this job, but it was a little bit less developed then. So yeah, I'm going to talk today about, or sort of try to get at this question whether individualized genetic interventions are research or treatment, and why does that question matter? And to do that, we're going to mainly draw on one case study. So there's a particular case study that I'll explain in a little bit of detail that kind of brought this question to a lot of people's attention, and specifically to the attention of the group of people that I have the privilege of working with, and that's where this paper or this book comes from. Okay. So this is research that draws on what I'm going to say, draws on research I've done with a team of people at Columbia and the Hastings Centre, Columbia University. And so this is a group led by Paul Applebaum, and it's funded by the was funded by the Human Genome Research Institute. We have a big project together. And this was a sort of an offshoot, like a supplement grant that we got to look at this particular question under the broader banner of looking at the implications of research in psychiatric, neurologic, and behavioural genetics more generally. And this was one particular issue that we kind of carved out and a subgroup of us looked at. But I did not, we all give our own talks. And so this is my talk, even though it's based on our shared research. So if there's anything wrong with it, that's my fault. Okay. So this case that I mentioned that kind of raised this question really publicly and really kind of in a really pointed and very high stakes way was a case of a young girl who had a form of Batten's disease, which is a kind of, I'm going to have to use my glasses here because I don't want to get any of this wrong about what exactly was wrong with this child. So she had this condition called Batten's disease, which is a rare condition, and in her case, caused by a very particular mutation in her own DNA. So there are more people with Batten's, not a lot of people, but many people with Batten's disease, and at this point, only one known person to have it due to this particular genetic mutation. So it's a very, very specific mutation that she had in her genes that cause this condition. So I'll just read you a little bit from our paper about what this is. So it's a rapidly progressive neurological condition, and so she was born seemingly healthy and then developed it when she was about 6 years old. It's pretty awful because it leads to blindness and seizures and a lot of kind of other horrible conditions, and there's no known intervention or cure for it. So she ended up seeing doctors at Boston Children's Hospital, and they identified this specific genetic variant that caused her version of Batten's disease. And this may mean something to some of you. It was a retrotransposon that disrupted RNA splicing. She was the only person ever known to have this particular genetic cause for Batten's disease. And in response to that, her doctors, and this is her mother on the right and her main doctor at Boston Children's on the left, Timothy Yu, he and a big team designed something that would correct the splicing error in her DNA. So it was an antisense oligonucleotide, which some people may know what that is, but essentially it was a specific response to her genetic mutation that would then correct the splicing error to some degree, enough that they hoped that it would give her some relief. So they tested the ASO that they developed. They tested it in cells taken from her body. And then they tested the ASO in rats, and then they administered it to her. She's the only person that has ever received this ASO. They called it Milasen after her, because her name was Mila or Milasen. And there is no anticipated use of it in any other patient at this point. So nobody else has that genetic mutation, and there isn't any particular second person or third person who anyone thinks will receive this drug called Milasen. So it took them about a year to develop the ASO and get it to the point where they would administer it to her, and she received it multiple times. I'll just go across here. They wrote this a report up on her case, was published in New England Journal of Medicine, and you can see all the long list of people involved there. What I'm going to sort of zero in on here is the timeline, because it gives you a sense of what happened. So in 2016, she got her clinical diagnosis, and just shortly after that, they identified the mutation. Then they established her own patient cell line, and identified an ASO that they could use, did some testing in the cell line and then in rats, and then they had permission to give it to her in February of 2018. She received it multiple times. So up here is the dosing schedule. So she didn't just get it once. So it's not like what we're kind of hoping a gene editing intervention might be, which would be that it would not have to be, well, the hope is it wouldn't necessarily be multiple applications, or but this was. So she received it multiple times with escalating doses and then maintenance doses. And there was some evidence that she had an improvement in her seizure, specifically, well, in particular in her seizure, and how many seizures she had. And her family also reported that she had a decreased number of hospitalizations for a period of time that's described in the report here. Unfortunately, though, it didn't actually cure her. So she died of Batten's disease in 2021. So 3 years after, I think it's 3 years after she was administered the ASO. But I've heard her mother speak about the case, about her daughter, and she at least believes that the quality of Mila's life was significantly enhanced by the ASO, if not the duration. So when this drug this paper was published, it generated a lot of attention because it was really the sort of first single use genetic intervention developed for a particular person. So it's a sort of prime example of the vision of the most personalized version of what personalized medicine might look like. So it offered a lot of hope to people with rare genetic conditions and ultra rare conditions. And as I kind of alluded to, it's not the only type of genetic intervention under development that's targeted to a particular person's DNA. So there are obviously gene editing interventions that are to be specific to people's DNA, and there have been already some administrations of those. It was a really important example of its use at the moment in sickle cell disease, and a patient who actually spoke at the International Gene Editing Summit in London, maybe earlier this year, who had been treated that way. But there are lots of people with those particular genetic mutations. This is an example of something that's much, much more targeted. And there are at least one or two other sort of types of intervention that would probably fall under this banner of like extremely targeted or individualized genetic interventions or genetic therapies. But so they raise a lot of interesting scientific questions and medical questions and a lot of hope for patients and families. But they also raise a bunch of research, sort of ethics questions and oversight questions. So I put some of the questions here. So in a case like this, questions would include things like how are we going to think about risks and benefits in a situation like this, where it's well, in extra high stakes because it's a child, but how are we going to define and assess them when we only have one patient or one person, and which risks would be acceptable to take and which were not. How can you ensure informed consent in a situation like this? What kind of informed consent should we be aiming for? Is this the kind of consent that you get from a patient who is consenting to a last resort treatment, or is this like a research ethics situation where you need big boundaries between the kind of therapeutic goals of care and what is defined as research? There are regulation and oversight questions. Do you use clinical type ethics oversight systems like hospital ethics committees, or do you go for research ethics oversight systems with independent review? Who has the authority to decide when to proceed and when to stop? Who has legal responsibility? Can subsequent examples, can this one example, what kind of evidence does that generate? How can that be used in future assessments of the same type of thing but not the exact same thing? And then there are a whole lot of really important cost and health equity questions. Who pays for the development of these kinds of interventions in their administration? Who has access to them? So in this case, or I'll say a little bit more about this particular case. So when our group kind of looked at this case, we kept and looked at these, generated a whole huge list of what we thought were the ethics and kind of oversight questions here. We kept coming back to this one question over and over again, which is like, well, is it research? Because if it's research, then there are certain answers to these questions. And if it's clinical innovation or clinical treatment, if this is like a patient with an unusual anatomy where a surgeon just creates something, a special kind of little device to use or a little method of dealing with that patient, that might be more like clinical innovation that kind of happens outside of research oversight. But so to us, it seemed like there would be very different answers to at least some of these questions, depending on whether or not this kind of case is research or if it's treatment. So that was our question. Was it ultimately all these things came down to whether or not it was an example of research or an example of treatment? And I'll maybe show a little bit about why that matters so much. So one obvious place in the US to go to get an answer to help start to unpack this a little bit is like to go to the Code of Federal Regulations, which governs research, human subject research, and see what is research. So if you look there, you can see that there is a definition of research. And I think, but don't know super well, that it's probably pretty similar to the definition used here, but I don't know that actually. Although fortunate to supervise a master's student with John, who's going to be looking into some of these questions in this context, in the New Zealand context. So it's a systematic, so according to this, it's a direct quote from the federal regulations. It's a systematic investigation, including research, development, testing, and evaluation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. And it goes on to specify that the definition of research applies whether or not people think that that's what they're doing. Obviously a lot matters on what generalizable knowledge is. Are you trying to develop generalizable knowledge? But somewhat unhelpfully, that's not defined in the regulations. There's quite a bit of, well, there's some literature on what generalizable knowledge is, although the term that's more often used or equated with it is for something to have external validity, for a study to have external validity, is at least considered to be required for something to be called generalizable. And in that sense, it just means that what you have done is going to be valid outside of the context in which you do it. So you can see why that might immediately create some challenges for a situation like this, because we know that the drug, the intervention itself, Milasen in this case, is not usable in anybody else. Yet generalizable knowledge suggests that you have created something that can be used in other people. So the way that, of course, when we start talking about this case, is you move really quickly from saying that the actual intervention is something that's generalizable knowledge that you could use in others, and it's a pathway or a way of developing to get to that point that might be the thing that's generalizable. But that isn't exactly how the FDA, for instance, regulates access to drugs and whether or not drugs are approved. It's like the actual intervention is what gets approved, not necessarily just the pathway. So it creates a lot of interesting puzzles in this sort of, to even get to answer this question of whether or not it's research or treatment. So beyond the federal regulations, we did look at to see, let me just maybe cash out a little bit what we sort of thought was at stake in this question. So if it's treatment, then the aim is to benefit the patient. And the emphasis then is on the doctor-patient relationship and the core values of clinical ethics. Beneficence, non-maleficence, respect for autonomy, but a big emphasis on not harming and helping the patient, right, on patient best interests. It might be funded by healthcare system or by private or public health insurance, depending on your, what system you're in. In the US, that would mean, public or private insurance, possibly overseen by a hospital ethics committee or some clinical ethics service. There might be some reason for consulting there. Where the intervention is an unapproved drug, it would need to be accessed in the US. So if the drug, if Milasen, which it is obviously, Milasen's not an approved drug at this point, if that's going to be accessed by the patient in a treatment context, then that would need to be under what's called an expanded access exemption to an existing clinical trial. So this is a really kind of slightly strange outcome of understanding this as treatment, which is then in order to access the medication that you have created for this one patient, you have to ask the FDA to give you an exception or an exemption to the requirement that you can only administer approved drugs. And the only way they have for doing that is as an exemption or exception to an existing clinical trial. But of course, there is no existing clinical trial by definition. So it's a really square peg round hole situation there in terms of the regulatory issue of how you access it. And I'll show you in a second that that's exactly what happened. And there probably are other implications of it being treatment as well. If it's research, then the aim is to develop generalizable knowledge. The emphasis is really significantly on free and informed consent. I'm not saying that there wasn't any consideration of risks and benefits, but there's a big emphasis on consent. And the avoidance of any therapeutic misconception, so any kind of mistaken idea on the part of the patient that they might benefit from it. Whereas you can imagine already that, like, absolutely Mila and her family thought that she might benefit from it, like that was completely their hope. It might be funded by a research funder instead of being funded by a clinical kind of like an insurance program, or like we have a national insurance program. Overseen by human subject research committees, which are called IRBs in America. And if the intervention is an unapproved drug, you'd need to go to a clinical trial. So that would be you'd apply to do a clinical trial. All right. Here's what actually happened though in this case. So maybe I'll just skip ahead to the next one. I'll come back to this one. So initially it started as clinical treatment, right? Clinical situation. Patient comes to the doctor, what's the diagnosis? This is straightforward, clinical. Then in the middle, the taking of her cells from her body, that everyone was really comfortable with that being research. Like, oh, that's research, that's human subjects research, taking her cells and growing them in a dish. So that went through human subjects approval. So an IRB, Research Ethics Committee, looked at a protocol to remove her cells from her body and study them. And there was some animal research there. So obviously they sort of knew what to do with that. That goes to an IRB and an animal care and use committee. And then it got really awkward when they wanted to actually administer it to her. And so what happened was the FDA asked for, said the FDA approved it under an expanded use or clinical compassionate sort of use exception, saying this is an unapproved medicine, but we're going to give this patient access to it because of their sort of that poor clinical situation. This is like their only last chance thing. And that's a pathway that was developed in large part, following HIV drug trials and protests by patients who weren't in clinical trials, and then breast cancer and other kind of patient support groups who have argued for access to drugs that are under investigation right now. But you might not be a patient that can get into that clinical trial for whatever reason, like you might be too sick, but you get access to it as a kind of exception to the clinical trial, like outside the clinical trial. But of course, as I've already said, there was no clinical trial going on for which she could get, but they did it that way anyway as a regulatory mechanism. The IRB chair looked at the administration protocol and said that they were comfortable with it, but that wasn't actually IRB approval. So they had some sort of involvement of the research ethics committee at the institution, but not official approval because they didn't think it was human subject research to administer the drug to her. So the FDA was involved because it was an unapproved intervention, but and so was the IRB, but not completely. So I kind of put that in brown as like it was a kind of unclear whether this was research or treatment. If you look at how they wrote about it in their article, published in NEGM, obviously a place where people publish research, but also a place where people publish case reports. They called this a brief report. They described what they had shown in this as a path. They also described it as a platform and an example of individualized genomic medicine, so kind of calling it a treatment. But they also called it an experience, the development of it, and a study. So it was a big mixture as well. They also, I haven't got a slide on this, but they in the middle here, if anyone's got really good eyes, they can see that they called it an N of 1 study. So, when we were developing our work on this, so we've got a paper that's about to be submitted and one that's already been published, we had a lot of discussion about what to call, whether to use that language of N of 1, whether to call it an intervention, a therapy, all those different ideas. And even though, so N of 1 simply means straightforwardly, there's one subject, one person, one example. And of course, this is technically a study with one person in it. So it's an N of 1 study, but N of 1 studies as a kind of type of study design are usually pretty different from this kind of thing. So they are often a situation in which the patient serves as their own control and switches back and forth between, say, 2 different drugs to see which one gives them the most symptomatic relief. And you can accumulate N of 1 studies and kind of look at them together. They aren't usually things where somebody is deteriorating and an intervention is administered and there's not sort of any going back on it. And there's a whole set of guidelines from the US federal government has guidelines for doing N of 1 studies, but they are absolutely not this kind of study. So we decided not to use N of 1 as our language to describe this kind of thing. We also chose not to call it a therapy, but an intervention, because we didn't want to say that it was already working. So we were kind of trying something neutral and descriptively accurate, but we don't call it N of 1. But they call it N of 1 as well at one point in their paper. Not because they're wrong, just I think like they were writing it up and they were like unclear what to call it, and they'd had a good experience with their own institution and how they developed it, where it was really unclear what whether it was research or treatment or both, or whether it switched between research and treatment. Like it's treatment, then it's research, then it's treatment again, or something else. We looked at a few other papers that have come out that have kind of discussed this case. So this is the paper from Alison Bateman-House and Lisa Kearns at NYU, talking about this study and this general area. And they kind of describe it as a troublesome liminal category, like they don't have an answer to the question whether it's research or treatment. They kind of say it's a bit unclear. Say that it blurs to the point of erasing the historically distinct lines separating research from treatment. So helpful paper, but doesn't actually answer the question. Maybe they think it's treatment. I say that partly because they call it therapeutic, but yeah. More clear is Patrick Kane and Merlin Bittlinger and Jonathan Kimmelman's paper in Nature Medicine, which talks a little bit about this case and some other. So they kind of create a grouping of what they call individualized therapy trials, and they say because individualized therapy trials involve treatments that are customized to patients, they're sometimes perceived as dissolving the tensions between the goals of research and care, but they disagree. They think that's completely an illusion. It's absolutely clear to them that this is research. So they say what we want to know from these trials is not merely whether an individual patient benefits, but whether the intervention algorithm has potential when applied to a series of patients to bring about outcomes that are better than alternative treatments. Sorry about that typo. They therefore constitute research even if treatments are tailored to individual patients. So they absolutely are, they're completely sure that this is research, despite the fact that there are these other goals in there. It's not. Yeah, they say lots of treatment involves therapeutic goals. So it's just, I mean, lots of research involves some kind of therapeutic goal. So they don't buy that at all. So they're clear. All right. So one of the things we weren't convinced, or we were sort of agnostic, still a bit agnostic about how to think about it. So we, mainly led by Sandra Susan Lee, who's an anthropologist, we did a series of semi-structured interviews with the parents of affected children, not kids with Batten's disease, but kids with various different conditions that are potentially going to be able to be targeted in this kind of way. And so we did that. It was like a purposive sample where you actually go to particular clinics that you know are developing these kinds of interventions and find a way to be able to access those patients. So we talked to 11 parents, 8 clinical geneticists involved in this general area, and 9 IRB members working at places that have these kinds of things under development, so a handful. I say we, but I did not lead these interviews. So we did 60-minute semi-structured interviews, sort of to the point of not exhaustion, saturation. All right, so we got 3, and then we analysed the data together. So we had 3 kind of overarching themes that came out of these interviews, which is that there was uncertainty amongst all 3 about how to categorise them, whether it's research or clinical care. There was a significant expectation of scientific benefit, but also of therapeutic benefit. And there were lots of questions about funding and access to these. So I'll just show you some quotes related to these different conclusions from these interviews. So sort of really specifically to my research question for this talk, whether or not this is intervention is research or clinical care. I've got 3 quote examples. There are more in the paper, which is in Genetics and Medicine. They're intertwined. There's no separation. That's a clinical geneticist between research and treatment. So these are people who are trained in medicine and research, who think this way all the time and see these as being completely intertwined. Then an IRB, right? They have a particular way of thinking. I'm definitely saying I don't think this would just be therapy. I think it is the beginning of research if itself is not it. If it's itself is not research. And then a parent, so when we pose this question to clinical geneticists and IRB members, obviously IRB members got the question. They were, yes, I know the question you're asking, but this is a hard case for this, basically. Parents just couldn't even begin to engage with the question, really. No disrespect to them, they were just completely perplexed by this question because they saw it as absolutely both. They couldn't understand why it was being asked, really. So one of them said, I guess you're pulling together certain strands of research or scientific concepts to make some best guess about this thing working in this condition. I don't know how to think about it. Is it a more clinical process, a clinical decision? I don't know. That's like one of the most articulate responses because most people just didn't get why we were asking this question even. Then, like I said, there was an expectation that there would be benefit. So this is one parent, it's a new modality that needs to be used on my child's mutation. This one, there are only about 20 people with that mutation. So if it works for her, it's going to work for others. However, once my child can show proof of concept that it works, then it's clinical care that that these other 19 kids will get. But that first tip of the sword is clinical research. So they were like expecting there to be some kind of what we would maybe call generalizable knowledge come out of the first application. It's hard to, and then an IB member says it's hard to call it generalizable to a wider group, but at the same time, they're going to learn about the side effects of giving this particular agent to this particular disorder or disease. So they were more struggling with whether or not you get something like knowledge out of it. And then on this funding issue, which people saw is very related to this question of whether or not it's clinical care or research. And of course, we think it's related as well, but like they saw it, yeah, so not necessarily just as a consequence of how you define it, but almost like part of how you would answer the question. I think that some parents and clinical geneticists and some of the IRB members could see really big problems with categorizing it as either research or clinical care in terms of access. So if it's categorized as research, then it would probably be funded by some kind of research organization and maybe have a kind of a straightforward way of prioritizing which people with the disease can go in the trial. But at the moment, actually, things like this are developed with funding often that the family raises for the research. So these families of kids with rare conditions, some of them create individual family foundations for their particular kid's condition, or they band together with the 5 other people in the world whose kids have that condition and with that genetic mutation and try to raise money together as kind of a group. And so they vary, it's almost on the, well, some of it is a little bit like, you know, kind of going online and getting your cancer treatment kind of a situation, rather than the kinds of places people normally go for research money. But they also blur the line a bit. And so I put a couple of quotes up here related to funding and access, because parents at least saw some of them saw a shared responsibility between the people who would benefit from the intervention and the broader kind of community or sort of society, if you like. So here the first parent says, I think there's a shared responsibility. There's a million sunk costs, but maybe at some point there's profit to the pharmaceutical company because they're leveraging it for other diseases. I just don't think it's fair whatsoever. So they also were quite, some of these families were quite sanguine about, about the idea, they were kind of accepted the idea that there's not going to be fairness in access. Even if drugs for common disease, even in drugs for common diseases, that's not getting passed on to one patient, that's getting spread across many different people that are paying for it. Should the government pay? I do think the government should contribute. So they didn't really like the idea of the current situation, which is that they would have to work to kind of generate the funds for their own child. They would like to see some kind of societal buy-in, but they didn't actually have like exactly the way figured out. And then a clinical geneticist, you know, brought the whole question back to whether it's generalizable or not, of whether or not you should be spending federal or, you know, public money on it. Okay, so lots of mixed kind of analysis from people who are actually involved in this kind of thing at the moment about how it should be understood. Let me just grab my notes here. So we concluded from our interviews that stakeholders do not think of this kind of individualized intervention as being either research or treatment, but they understand it as pushing the boundaries of both of those things. And they really see themselves as helping to develop a particular platform that can be used in other people. They are really hopeful about the generalizability to some degree of some parts of what is being developed. And they are really, really optimistic that even if their own child didn't benefit from the case of the parents, or in the case of clinical news, even if this patient didn't benefit, that they would learn things that could be applied to other people and benefit others in the future. So they really did see that it had a kind of a knowledge generation capacity thing going on. So this led us to consider the possibility that it might be a hybrid research treatment undertaking that aims to benefit the patient and develop something like generalizable knowledge. It doesn't develop the intervention is not going to be generalizable, but the pathway, a lot of the steps could be generalizable in some sense to others. This would be a muddier situation than the kind of clarity that people are looking for when they say it's research or treatment. You would need to maintain, we think it's got benefits. So we think it's just a description of what's happening. It's actually a mix of treatment and research. Then there are normative elements to that, like, is that okay? Well, it's good that it matches what people are experiencing. So that's a benefit of seeing it that way, is that you're actually staying true to the experience of the family plus the scientists and clinicians and oversight professionals involved. It allows you to maintain the doctor-patient relationship and not sort of have to put on a completely different hat or bring in a different team necessarily. And you can see why in the case of a child like that, that might be really important. It keeps the core values of clinical ethics front and center in the case. But it does mean that you have a really important challenge around patient understanding of risks and uncertainty of therapeutic benefit that you have to address. And it means that you will have some challenges protocolizing what you're doing. So there will be an element of clinical judgment that needs to be maintained rather than being able to in advance say, here's when we would stop administering, or here's when we, really being clear about the clinical stopping points and things like that. It's a little harder to do. It might be funded by a mixture of research funds and health insurance. So actually, in the case of Milasen, it was funded by the foundation that her parents created for her research on her condition, and by internal funds, research funds at the institution at Boston Children's Hospital. So it was a hybrid funding. It might be overseen by a human subject research committee and a hospital ethics committee, which is actually kind of what happened as well. And subsequent to this case, Boston Children's created a special committee to look at these cases. So they kind of created something that didn't exist already, which we could, I don't know a lot about that committee, but I'm imagining that it's doing some of this back and forth between research and clinical care. So that's challenging because that seems like a lot of resources would go into a case like this. So you'd have to look for some kinds of efficiencies. And it might be that there are so few of these happening that things can be done at a national level, which I think is probably what would happen here. Where it's an unapproved drug, which it always will be almost always, access via a single patient clinical trial is kind of what you end up doing. And so there's already work going on the FDA to look for efficiencies in their regulatory system to see when they can cross-use evidence. I think there should be expectations to share data and outcomes like there are in research. So that's a good thing about kind of keeping the research element going. And we kind of talked a lot about this actually, that like there's a goal of transitioning from a hybrid to just being treated. That's the pathway you're on. So it would still be that that would still be an expectation. And so you might end up with some of these treatments being able to be developed in a way that doesn't count as research at all. It's just treatment. All right, so that's the kind of work, and I'll be just really happy to answer questions, especially keen to hear what you think about how that might fly here.
Thank you. So we can see if there are any questions online.
Yeah, let's get out of this.
Usually, and then there's a way of
yes.
Yeah, awesome.
And then we'll see. Let's maximize that, I think.
That's great. Thank you.
Yep.
So
okay.
Any questions from people online? No? Okay, yeah, that's through. I had a whole bunch of questions.
Okay, go ahead.
So I could just keep asking them until we sort of lift their hand up. So one of the things that was great, I really enjoyed. There's a whole lot of things that came out of that for me. So I was thinking that this looks like something which is both research and treatment. It has bits of both at different stages. And so I was thinking about that federal definition. And so one thought was maybe there are lots of things that are treatment, but will also meet the federal definition of research, because it's about how things are set up and what you're aiming at doing. So that might not be too much of a problem. The related question was, there was a thing that people were talking about a few years ago that, so Charles Vayer was one of the authors of it, and they're talking about this, how we could accommodate the breaking down of the therapeutic, non-therapeutic distinction. And they came up with this idea of component analysis, where they said what we should be thinking about in research where you've got bits of both going on is analysing the different components, the different things that people are doing, to think about what the regulative and ethical considerations that apply are. So I wondered about that for this.
So I should look at that. I knew there'd be something from Charles.
Yeah.
Really.
That was a while ago. I didn't really take off, but it seems.
So one of the things I've wondered about is sort of along the same lines. So I haven't read that paper, so I will. But where it takes me in my head is like, because we've thought about this, we're like, maybe we should just say it's fine that it's not a hybrid all the time. It's just like this bit's research, this bit's clinical care, this bit's research, this bit's clinical care, like that. Maybe that's actually what it would look like on our hybrid model from a regulatory, from an oversight perspective. Let's say that might be what it looks like at oversight. It's like, oh, now that IRB is having a look at it, oh, now it's going back to a clinical ethics committee or whatever. But I feel really uncomfortable with the idea of telling that to patients. Seems like an unreasonable thing to ask patients to get behind, the idea that we're going to be going like this and back and forth and back and forth. And, you know, especially in this case, like the idea that the research element was the taking of her skin cells, but that we might think but that like giving her the drug and then monitoring how she does and all of that data that they get, that wasn't research from her perspective. Like, so for me, I feel a wee bit nervous about the idea of patients having to understand that. Like, I don't know if it helps them to do it that way, if it feels even true. It just seems really confusing.
Because consent is the fix for those things.
But can you imagine like doing one kind of consent and then having another kind of consent with different people and then going back again, and the patient's just looking for their doctor and this is their doctor? So I feel like it might be that when you acknowledge that something is a mix, you're also acknowledging that it's the mix that it is will change in different parts. So sometimes the mix is heavily research and a little bit of clinical, and then maybe the mix is a bit different. Later it splits or something. Rather than saying that you are actually doing a thing that has multiple components, each one is like going to be characterized as one or the other. You're just acknowledging that the kind of mixes varies a bit. I just don't like, and so therefore you're using one of your oversight tools more than the other. But I don't like the idea that patients have to understand that they are kind of like that patients would be flipping between paradigms. That seems hard to me. I think it's what happened to them, but like they don't remember it that way.
But just before we move on, I was thinking about, say, clinical trials in oncology. That might happen a bit where you have your oncologist, but then you might have the research nurse that you're talking to about the research as well. So you've got two lines of. So it may not be that.
It seems like I get that it's on a continuum with those kinds of things. I guess the kind of challenge to our conclusion about it being a hybrid is why would we not just, why is it just not a version of that? Why is there a need for a different way of talking about it in this kind of case? And I guess part of why I feel like there might be is because when a patient understands that they're the only one, it's very hard, I think, to then say that this is also some kind of big study. I don't know. That's where I feel like maybe that does make a difference, that it's just this one person. Like there's no sense of like, I'm an individual patient getting my care and I'm part of this bigger study. That maybe that's something that you can hold in your head a little bit easier than the idea that you are the study.
Simon has his hand up.
Neil's first, actually, but thanks, John. Neil?
Thanks, John, and thanks, Josie. That was really interesting. I just early on you mentioned that paper. That was very clear that this was a bit of research.
Yeah.
And their reason seemed to be that when you look at what they were doing, they were really trying out whether you could develop a drug that quickly and make it work. So rather than anything else. But what kind of struck me was that we came across something rather similar when we were writing the national standards for NEAC about whether the standard should apply to audit. And there was some opposition, or there was some thought that audit shouldn't be included under the national standards because it wasn't research. And our response was really actually to expand the standards to include audit, which was probably a little bit cheeky. But the underlying issue that I felt was that these are not natural kinds.
Yeah.
Research, clinical care, innovation, these are not natural kinds. You're not going to find an independently existing definition, which you can then say, oh, this fits or it doesn't, so it must be some other kind. So it's kind of up, and it's almost to me as if research isn't defined only in terms of, if it is defined in any terms, in terms of what you do, but also in how you then view it as a society about whether you're going to have independent review. So that the way you review it and whether you think it's research kind of come together rather than what you do being based upon your independent definition of the thing. Now, I'm not saying this helps you very much, but it kind of makes the confusions, which I feel just like you do, appear in a slightly different kind of way. They appear not because we don't know what it is, but because we don't quite know what to do in response to it.
Trying to think. So the intention, no. So the intention is clear. It's just confusing how to respond to the, like, what kinds of oversight, for instance, to give it. That's the only confusion, rather than like what's actually being.
Well, I suppose I'm probably saying that the two things are mixed up, but that at least part of the problem is knowing what to do, as opposed to knowing what it is.
Yeah. But you have to, that might be right. So people who want to, so people like the Kimmelman paper, the Kane paper, they want to argue that any, it's sort of a one drop rule for research. If it's got research goals, it's research. Like, it's not going to ever be, like, everything's got, a lot of things have mixed goals, but if they have any research goals at all, that it's research. And then you sort of know what to do. Easy. You just put it through your research pipeline, kind of in terms of oversight and everything else. And I guess maybe what we are wanting, perhaps, without, I'm not sure. Part of what we were trying to do was just describe it. But I guess what I have ended up feeling is that I also want there to be a mixture of both kinds of ethics and both kinds of oversight, and I guess maybe both kinds of regulation even applied. But I hesitate because I know that's really hard to do. Yeah. Simon?
Yeah, so thanks, Josie. My comments or thoughts are similar to Neil, and I'm sorry if I missed something earlier, but I agree with what Neil said. There's not going to be an independent, non-arbitrary distinction between the two categories we're talking about. So this is something that Wittgensteinians, it's a point they're fond of making. And there's lots of examples in the world, the things that we describe where it's entirely about what we care about, the way that we're living, which determines what we're going to call a thing. So arguing about whether it's research or a clinical intervention could go on indefinitely and not get anywhere. So then my thought is, okay, what do we need these two oversight functions or categories for? And it strikes me that a distinction between research and a clinical intervention is that with a clinical intervention, you've got an established way of doing things, which the profession has endorsed. And in this case, there is no such thing because this is novel. So that is a reason to have an external committee to look at it, which would be like what we have for research.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's just as far as I've got with my comments.
Yeah. So when the FDA, so now the FDA has said that these kinds of interventions must be looked at by an IRB. And so maybe this is okay if you're a Wittgensteinian. Like, they don't say why, right? They just say, they don't say something like, because we consider it to be research and to meet the definition. They just say, in order for this to proceed with us, we need to see IRB oversight of this.
Yeah, but there would be a why. You would say,
There is a why.
We couldn't rely on the individual clinicians to make the determination as to what's,
Right.
the appropriate balance of benefits and harms in this context. So the reflection that I think is needed is what really matters. What do all the stakeholders need to be worried about? And then what's the most effective way of ensuring that those values are upheld? And it potentially it's a whole new category, or it's, as you say, a blend. And I'd be perfectly comfortable with that.
Yeah, and they don't care. I mean, they're pragmatic, right? They don't care. It's not any interest to them whether it's because it meets a different, well, it's of some interest, but it's not why. It's not because it meets research. It's just that they would like to see those kinds of protections in place, period.
Yeah, so the thought is what matters, what's important, not how should we describe this. Thanks.
Jing Bao is a person.
Thank
Hi,
you,
Jing Bao.
Josie. One comment, like kind of question. A quick comment is your ethical device here, your employee care is very much reminded me what Confucius called 正面 rectifying names. I think this have not been adequately acknowledged in bioethics, and how that would really to rectify the terms, words, definitions, and because ethical discussion often, like especially abortion, euthanasia debate, powerfully illustrated, and our language is often ethically laden itself. So a question is that I wonder whether we can make to say that argument to say it's not research because it's not contributed to generalizable knowledge might be wrong. A good example could be the statement, all swans are white. Now identify one black swan can significantly contribute to general knowledge about the color of swans. That's it.
Maybe I think I
overcome that.
I think I have to think about it. I might not be thinking about it right. Yeah, I think I'm getting some sort of in my head some version of yours and Simon's point together, which is that, like, how useful is it really to even use those, like to rely on the terms to do much for you, because it can just lead you. Anyway, maybe I feel like you've given me a riddle that I need to solve. So I think I'll have to think about it.
Yeah, actually, I have not quite a question, but my concern that I seek for your further thoughts, like in case it's defined as a hybrid of research and kind of clinical stuff. My concern is how about a situation in which different committee or agency reach different conclusion, or if they declare, because many different agencies involved in this stuff it may delay in the process. That's
Yeah.
the first issue. Another issue I concern is how you mentioned there's different kind of funds, so how to divide the portion of fund. And the third issue related to the two issues is how to divide or how to define the responsibility of, enriching a conclusion or decisions, because different HG involve how to define their responsibility therein.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's much cleaner and easier, but still hard if it's one or the other. And maybe, I don't know if it's easier if it flips between them, like if it's one and then later it's another and then it goes back to being the other. I don't know if that's easier then, but I certainly see why it's easier if it's one or the other. But I wonder if I don't know, but I wonder if there are other examples of where it's just accepted that something is a mixture and that both kinds of systems need to be navigated. If that, given that that's what we're asking here, or that we think might have to happen or something, it seems like the question then becomes, is there a way for that to happen efficiently? Now, this is a totally different realm, but I used to sit on a stem cell research oversight committee that was applying guidelines that also, research that also had to usually go before an animal research ethics committee and often also a human subject research ethics committee. So it had 3 committees. Some of the studies we looked at went before 3 committees. And the big sort of the like key to making that an okay experience, maybe not as good as if they just went to one, I'm sure, but was that for the committees to talk to each other. That was the big way to make it. Yeah.
So in cases like cancer, where there is real clinical urgency, it gets difficult with additional oversight. It gets difficult because you have decisions very fast.
I think that's why maybe they have tried to create a third, a separate committee for this purpose. The only problem with that, of course, is that because research ethics stuff is law governed by federal regulation and clinical ethics is not, then you can't sort of create a committee and say we're going to ask them to look at research and also clinical issues, but they're not actually an IRB. Like, you can't do that, like, just sort of from the rules perspective. So you'd be really hard to not. I mean, maybe it's convenient at the end there that they're like, that last bit where we actually give the patient the thing that we've created, that's not research, because then we can get a clinical ethics sign off quickly. I don't know. But then they miss out on some of the protections of research committees. So.
Yeah, but it's very important to make decisions fast, and there may be multiple decisions made in a short period of time. So it's just practical to go through committees all the time.
Yeah, time to therapy is always a
they went really quickly.
There are a couple of questions in the chat. I see there's one from Andrew and one from.
Just let me know the seminar rooms need to be used at too.
Oh, is it?
Yes.
Okay, so maybe we can very quickly do these. Probably not. We'll probably better wrap it up.
We could wrap it up, and I can look at the written questions.
Yeah.
Okay,
That's
good.
Thank you, Renee.
Yeah, thanks very much. Patients that will know that treatment they're getting is innovative. Yeah.
Experimental treatment as well.
Thank you. Yeah, yep. I don't know if they want they use the experiment. Research like innovative treatment. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks.
What's your name?
Harry Gilman.
Harry
Gilman.
Gilford.
Yeah.
Are you a clinic?
Geneticist.
Okay. Oh wow. Okay.
Thanks for doing a lot of work in medicine and therapy against research.
Oh, we should. Oh.
Yeah, good. We've got lots of dilemmas with this, and we go follow our patients through stomach cancer risks and these sorts of things happening now. Precision medicine, you've got to make decisions very fast.
Got a paper and draft on that actually.
Oh, have you?
Lunch.
Oh, really?
And consent. Yeah, we should. Maybe we should.
Yeah. It's good to do the stomach cancer stuff with us because New Zealand story and the
Oh.
Mari issue.
Well, I'm just fairly new, and I'm looking for some projects that don't just involve my colleagues in America, but I'd love to have some more projects here.
Yeah. So
So,
the angle I had on this was this is kind of really informing people about what this means, questions, and that's getting surgeons, police, so there's something to that. Yeah, we get a room.
okay, we have, I actually have to come back to the room.
Oh, do you? Sure.
Doing that thing.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Andrew, did you want to say something about that? It's nice to see you.
No, not really. I can just email the same thing to you.
Okay.
Yeah, that'll be fine.
Yeah.
Great stuff. Thank you. Good stuff.
Nice to see you. I've got lots of other questions for you actually. I was going to ask you about something else, so totally unrelated, but I have a friend coming to New Zealand in early November, and he's a philosopher of disability.
Right.
And I'm trying to set up some talks, and I there's probably an official channel to go through, but do you think that someone like, he's the founding and editor of the Journal of Philosophy and Disability, and I thought he might be of interest to people in philosophy. We could do
Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, our oh, looks like there's another class coming in. Our seminar is just an interim thing, so it would be finished by then. But yeah, I'm imagining that there would certainly be interest in hosting something, or we could co-host it with you guys. And
yeah. Oh, okay.
yeah,
All right, I'll be in touch with someone, though I think I know who the person is.
Yep, terrific. Okay, thanks.
Bye.
See you soon. Bye.
Do you want to copy and paste those questions?